The views and opinions on Where Did the Road Go belong to those making them. Do not mistake allowing freedom of speech for agreement.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
So, I have on with me right now Mr. Greg Bishop, and I'm going to run the, unfortunately, only one show I did with Christopher O'Brien, the late Christopher O'Brien. And Greg, you were good friends with him.
Yeah, we met, I think, in the early 2000s, and he became one of the people that was on my show as a guest really early on, more than anyone else. He had the record of 6 or 7 or 8 shows, just because we really liked talking. And I found out that his journey through the cattle mutilation mystery kind of mirrored my thing with the UFO. We had both come to the conclusion that there was no conclusion, and looking for an answer was holding us both back from any kind of understanding. And so with that in mind, we got along really well. And plus, he was really funny. We laughed so hard. That's what I remember best about Chris, is just this ridiculous, unconventional, completely no holds barred sense of humor. And that, like I said, that's what I remember about Chris the most. I was visiting with him once, and I threw a Tic Tac in the air, a cut candy he'd given me. I took a picture of it, and I showed him the picture. It was an absolutely perfect picture of this Tic Tac candy in the air, horizontal. And I just tossed it in the air.
Nice.
And I said, Chris, look. And we both laughed so hard we had to sit down on the curb and laugh about the possibilities of what you could do with that picture, which I never did anything with it. But, I remember so many things with Chris, but that's one of the ones I'll remember forever.
Nice.
And he was amazing. I mean, he really broke ground about the cattle mutilation thing.
Yeah, I mean, he's written the definitive book on that with Stalking the Herd.
Yeah, in fact, I think that was his last book on the cattle mutilation mystery, and I begged and pleaded with him to let me write the foreword, and he let me do it. And so I was so proud to be able to introduce the book for him. And I don't write too many intros for books, and that one was just a memorable one for me. And so I treasure that too. And also the times we used to meet up and hang out, and we went out in the desert with my drone and did some filming a few times. It just, I really miss it a lot.
And when did he pass away? Roughly
last month. Roughly. Wait, I can tell you exactly if I look at my calendar, because I know what happened right beforehand. It was in November. So it was November 24th, I think.
Okay. And do you know what happened?
24th or 25th. I don't know what happened, but the best information I have, and probably other people do, is that he had a breathing issue, a respiratory issue, and it just dogged him off and on for the last 10 years of his life. And apparently what happened was he had some sort of attack where he couldn't breathe, so he was driving himself to the hospital in Sedona, where he was working on a film, and he apparently either lost consciousness or had a heart attack or something and lost control of the car. The car crashed into a big stone sign, and I guess he was dead on the scene. The weird thing is that the guy he was working with, Ron James from MUFON, took a picture the next day when he got back of the sign that Chris ran into, and it was for a church called the Church of Christ, and his car accident had knocked the T off the sign, so it said Church of Chris.
Wow.
Another weird thing that happened is I started a GoFundMe to help pay for his funeral expenses, which is still up.
Okay.
As when I first read the email where this woman was saying, I can't remember who it was, said, this is how much it's going to cost for the, I don't know about the coroner because they don't charge you for that, but for the funeral expenses and the cremation and internment. And as I'm reading this, I'm listening to a song on the radio, and right when I see that she's planning this and the costs, I had a brownout and the record stopped. It just slowed down and stopped.
Huh.
The funny thing is the song that was playing was the song March to Heaven by the Fibonacci's. Huh. So I told Ron Regehr, his friend, he said, Chris is still messing with you. And I said, yep.
So at that point, my conversation with Greg got disconnected, and we couldn't get reconnected. So that's the intro. Turns out I did 2 shows with Chris a month apart, both on Stalking the Herd, both in 2014. I believe these were both live on WVBR, May 17th, 2014, and June 21st, 2014. There was no extra stuff because we weren't doing Patreon or anything at that point. So I've cleaned these up a little bit. The first one sounds okay. The second one, he's on, I think, a cell phone. If I remember right, he wasn't home, but he wanted to do the show. So the connection's not as good. It doesn't sound quite as full as the first show does, but I did what I could to clean them up. So here you go, in tribute to Chris O'Brien. And as always, I am your host, Soraya, here on Where Did the Road Go? And tonight we have, what we've determined is going to be part 1 of a 2-part interview with Mr. Chris O'Brien. Are you with us, Chris?
I'm here.
All right. And you've written quite a few interesting books, and your latest is called Stalking the Herd, which focuses on cattle mutilations, and it's kind of an epic of a book. And you've been investigating this stuff for, about 20 years?
Yeah.
And you have 5 books or 4?
Well, I've written 6. 5 have been published.
Okay. Oh, okay. And you want to tell people a little bit about your background?
Well, I've always had an interest in, the paranormal, fringe subjects, if you will. I had a real progressive mom growing up who spent some time back east and, in Asia, and my grandfather also. And she was very into, real forward-thinking things. She was into grafting fruit trees together. I grew up with an apple tree that had 5 different kinds of apples. She was an organic gardener. Just really, really talented. She was a dowser and did pendulum divination and all sorts of stuff. So I was surrounded by, these progressive subjects from a very early age. So, it wasn't something that was frowned upon around the house. And I did have an interesting experience when I was 7 years old. It really, really kind of jump-started my interest in aliens, potentially, unidentified object reports. The guy that built the house that we moved into in 1970 was best friends with Roger Patterson and talked to me quite a bit about, Roger Patterson, Bob Gimlin, and John Green and some of the early, Bigfoot hunters. And my grandfather was aware of the 1920s event, Mount St. Helens, where the miners were attacked by Bigfoot because one of the miners shot one. And then that night they were accosted by a whole group of them. And, I read all these books when I was very young, everything from, Frank Edwards, Raymond Fowler, of course, John Keel, later on, Jacques Vallée. And I moved to New York City out of high school. I grew up in Washington State. And I quickly learned that you're not going to make a lot of friends and influence people by talking about these subjects. So I was pretty closeted about it. I didn't really, my closest friends knew of my interests and stuff. And they were okay about it. But, when you're hanging out, at an after hours club down in Manhattan at 4 a.m, UFOs and aliens or, any of those types of subjects are the last thing you're going to be talking about. So plus, heck, you live in the center of Manhattan. It's hard enough just to see the sky, let alone see anything flying around in it. So
True.
I did have my first real bona fide UFO sighting in, it would have been 1979 up in New Paltz, New York. A group of us went to a Gentle Giant concert, and after the show, we were hanging out in the football field and saw a group of what appeared to be very high in the sky, brilliant points of light. At first, the only reason why I noticed them is because I caught one of them moving. And as soon as I looked at it, it stopped moving. And so I stared at it for a while, and I saw that they were kind of milling around. And we did a little experiment with it and kind of had some sort of semblance of an interactive experience. And then we got bored and went to a party. So, that's pretty much the extent of my interest and involvement up to I moved to Colorado in 1989. It just so happened to be the birthplace of the publicized cattle mutilation phenomenon, the first real major case that gained international attention. happened in September '67 on a ranch that was, only about 40 miles from me where I lived in Colorado. And the Snippy the horse case, of course, many people are aware of it, and it's kind of gone down in the annals of the strange as being the first real publicized unexplained livestock death. And when I got there, I did ask a few of the old timers around there about it and about the UFO sightings. There were hundreds and hundreds of UFO sightings the end of the 60s into about 1970, and then a big wave of mutilation cases in the mid 70s. And I just quickly realized that I was a new guy around there, and again, I wasn't going to make very much headway socially if I professed more than a passing interest in these subjects. And it wasn't until November '92, the little town I lived in at the time only had about 200 people. I was a gigging musician for many years, and on that weekend in November of '92, there was an amazing UFO sighting of two large 100-foot ovals that came down out of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, flew out into the valley, and were seen by quite a number of people in the town. And unfortunately, I wasn't around. I missed it. I heard, kind of rumors of it, but I didn't really pay much attention. And then I had a New Year's Eve party, a month or so later, and at one point, everywhere I went in the party, there were little knots of people sitting there talking about this sighting. So I was at the time writing articles for my little paper, the town paper, and I went ahead and started, just kind of checking into their stories and cross-referencing their accounts. And then somebody chimed in, oh, that was the same night there was a cattle mutilation down in Costilla County, which is a couple of counties south of me. And so that really kind of got my juices going. And I thought, man, I'm going to come up with a tongue-in-cheek, kind of cynical, cool article and, poke fun at some of the hippie types that lived in the town I lived in. And maybe these guys were, still had stashes of mushrooms in their freezers or something. And, I was going to put a cynical New York spin on it. And I had 2 weeks before I had to turn my article in. And so I really dove in and started researching the history of the area. And just within days, I knew that it was a complete treasure trove of stories, legends, documented reports, databases, amazing accounts, A to Z in the paranormal. Pretty much anything that you can imagine has been reported in the San Luis Valley, which is the largest alpine valley in the world. It's completely, ringed and surrounded by the Rocky Mountains. It's nestled in kind of on the spine of North America, and it's a sacred site to Native Americans. There's amazing, kind of fairly impressive geophysical anomalies there. There's a tradition of sacredness. It's the only area in North America that three regional groups of Indians overlap. It has some of the more enigmatic sacred sites in the Four Corners area are up there, including the Sacred Mountain of the East, Blanca Peak, which, as I found out later, had sightings going all the way back to the 1770s. So, within this 2 weeks, I managed to locate, some of the top experts in the cattle mutilation phenomenon: Linda Moulton Howe, Tom Adams, David Perkins. I spoke with local sheriffs who were involved in the 70s, investigating hundreds of cases, and Dr. Lynn Weldon, the head of the sociology department at Adams State College. And my little 500-word article blossomed into almost a 2,000-word article, and it was the first of a series of articles that I did every month. And I just was inundated with interest from all around the world. And within 2 months, I was on national TV. So I started a snowball down the hill that even if I wanted to stop it, I don't think I could.
Okay, and you've written 3 books on the San Luis Valley, right?
Correct.
Okay, and one on the trickster phenomena?
Correct.
And of course, this latest one on the mutilations.
Right.
Now, in the latest book here, you start out talking about how cattle is related to the human race throughout our history.
Right. Yeah, it's really important, I think.
And why do you feel that's important to the mutilation mystery?
Well, for thousands of years, we worshipped and held very sacred bulls and cows. In India, we still do today. Humans revere the sacred white Brahma cattle of India, and if you trace back the sacredness that we've held cattle in very high regard for thousands of years, if you trace it back, you'll find that there's an interesting spiritual relationship, symbiotic relationship with cattle and humans. I found out a very surprising fact, just to give you an idea. First of all these cattle that we see around today, 1.37 billion cattle, are recent hybrids. In the last 10,500 years, we've been able to take 80 animals in the first herd of domesticated aurochs, which were actually a huge wild beast, 10 foot at the shoulder, 2,500, even possibly 3,000 pounds. These things were just ferocious wild animals. And we were able to contain, I say we, it was a bunch of herdsmen or, proto-cowboys, ranchers in northern Iran, were able to contain a herd of 80 animals. And from those 80 animals, we have created 940 some odd breeds of cattle and 1.3 plus billion head of cattle on the planet. So that's where it all started. And then it's interesting to kind of trace the development of belief systems around bulls and cows, and how the bull worship, which is kind of a solar aspect of religious belief, goes to the West. And today, of course, you have the fighting bulls in Spain and bullfighting, and then if you go to the East, you see more of a cow aspect or a lunar aspect. Of course, I'm giving a Cliff Notes sort of general version here.
Oh, yeah.
It obviously becomes way more complicated, especially when you go south into Egypt, where bulls and cows were very important and worshipped pretty much equally. The whole Minoan civilization, which pretty much you can tie into the Greeks and later the Romans, that was totally based on cattle worship. You go down into East Africa with the newer Maasai and Dinka cultures, they still to this day, cattle are their lives. That's their form of money even. So there are sacred traditions, and there's cattle have been held in high esteem and been treated ceremoniously for thousands of years. And now, in the modern age, we have a very unceremonious relationship with cattle.
Yeah.
In some of these feedlots and rendering operations, we can render up to 400 animals an hour, which is done pretty much by hand. And that's just one feedlot. And I think it's interesting that if you look at these big feedlots and these rendering operations that exist today, that's a fairly recent development in the rendering of beef protein, and these super industrial big agro operations tend to exist now, where we had the highest rates of incidence back in the 70s when cattle mutilations were one of the biggest news stories of the decade. Thousands and thousands of animals were discovered and by ranchers and law enforcement who claimed that they had been, unnaturally killed somehow and disfigured, taking away the soft tissue organs. Usually the tongue is gone from deep within the esophagus. The mandible flesh on the jaw is neatly and cleanly excised. Reproductive organs are gone. If it's a cow, the mammary glands are bagged, the udders are gone. Oftentimes the rear end is taken out in a like a plug. Sometimes an eye, sometimes an ear, sometimes a patch of hide is expertly cut off, and there's no real way to explain the lack of tracks of physical evidence at the site. There's rarely any sort of crime scene evidence, although that's not always the case. And this became a real law enforcement puzzle, especially in the mid-'70s. And there were a handful of investigators who were running around documenting these cases, working with law enforcement, working with newspapers, editors in hard-hit locations. And many of them created databases that have never been brought together before. They've all been kind of stovepipe side by side. And my book is the first time that all this data has been brought together, in one book. So I think it's an important work. I think it has a lot of information that puts the whole mystery into a cultural context in terms of the before mentioned history that we have with cattle.
Mm-hmm.
And it also brings up some very, very serious health issues and environmental concerns that we should have in regards to cattle and using cattle as a source of beef, protein.
Now, one of the things that's interesting about the whole cattle mutilation epidemic is that they're so, you went over the basic idea of what a cattle mutilation is, but some of them are so different, but yet have similar characteristics. It just becomes utterly puzzling after a while.
Yeah, there is quite a bit of consistency. But as soon as you think you've found a pattern and you keep your mouth shut, it'll supply the mystery of the phenomenon will supply enough data to get you all excited. And invariably, when you open your mouth and tell anybody about it, that's when it shifts to the exact opposite.
So it has a very
which is the trickster element.
And it's. I mean, reading through these different cases, they're really bizarre in some cases, and there are some cases where they're likely just misidentified predator action as well.
Yeah. Usually when the media gets involved, let's say regional or national media coverage erupts around an outbreak of cases. Generally, that doesn't happen with just a single or a sporadic case, but when there's a number of counties and ranches and law enforcement agencies and county officials that are reporting these cases, then the media invariably gets involved. It becomes a news story. And then you have a lot of people that are running around, kind of keeping their eye out for dead cows. And when they see one, they're not veterinary pathologists. They don't have the training to really ascertain, tanatogenesis, the cause of death, or what could have been responsible for the disfigurement. And oftentimes, the soft tissue organs are the first organs that scavengers will go after to get into the viscera, into the body cavity. And it's only if you've been trained to really, analyze these cases, and I'm an amateur, I'll be the first to admit that, but I do have enough, I've been given enough, pointers, and I've done enough research and talked with a number of vets and veterinary pathologists and law enforcement. And so I've been sort of trained to know what to look for. And but the average person doesn't have that training. And to them, it looks like a strange mutilated animal that's drained of blood, that's, maybe been dropped from a great height, has laser cuts is something that you hear all the time, or cookie cutter incisions. That's another buzz term. It's totally drained of fluids. And generally these are just the descriptions are the product of ignorance and not knowing what they're looking at. And when the media gets involved and starts, announcing that these things are happening, then that has the unfortunate effect of going ahead and creating cases that may be just unusual looking scavenger action that are being reported as mutilations. And you do have a bit of hysteria that breaks out in these areas, these regions and ranching communities where these cases are occurring, the real cases are occurring. So it makes it really doubly difficult for investigators to target their resources, target their time expenditures, and be able to be as efficient as possible instead of concentrating on the important cases that are extra mundane. All these other reports have a tendency of watering down investigators' efforts and keeps us running around and not being able to to really focus our attention properly. I covered an area of over 10,000 square miles. I put 300,000 miles on my truck in 6 years. Wow. So, we're talking an amazing amount of country to cover. I lived 60 miles from near a stoplight. It took me 120 miles round trip just to go to a movie, go to a doctor, a hospital, go to a large hardware store, a Walmart. That was all 60 miles away. Although I could see the town from my house, it took me, an hour to get there. So, this is a very remote part of the country, and in a lot of the areas where these cases are reported are in remote areas of the country. Not all of these cases are reported, in middle of BF nowhere, but there are some cases that have occurred right in town, for instance, in Taos and Las Vegas and other places. There was a case that happened right within sight of the door leading underground the Cheyenne Mountain NORAD facility. And there was another case a few months later. It was right around the north side of Cheyenne Mountain and some of the most secure military space on the planet. Yeah. So there are cases that have occurred in areas that are extremely well monitored. We had over 80 cases in the Malmstrom missile fields, for instance, around Malmstrom Air Force Base, up in southeastern Montana, and the missile fields in northeastern Colorado, southwestern Nebraska. There's a big missile field around there. There's missile fields around Offutt Air Force Base, Fort Sill. Pretty much these cases tend to occur fairly near military installations and bases, which I find is an interesting kind of potential correlation.
Yeah.
It is a very complex subject. It's not something that you can cover in a simple 200-page book that's got space and a half spacing. This is a 500,000-page manuscript, and I literally pulled out 200 pages, which will go into an analytical book that'll be a follow-up to this one.
And how far back you traced through some of the history of possible mutilations prior to the most famous modern case?
Right. Yeah. The earliest case that I can find that's actually documented where something was written down, descriptions were given, come from the records of King James I of England, which these cases occurred in early 1606. Hundreds of sheep were being reported mutilated in a strange condition. And the last line of the of the entry in the court record is very interesting. It's of these things, sundry conjectures, but most agree it tendeth toward fireworks. So you kind of scratch your head and try to figure that one out.
Yeah. And but you cover a lot of, well, not a lot, but a few out of the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah, early 1800s as well in Ireland. Right. There were some late 1800s cases. There were cases around the turn of the century, 1902, 1905, 1920 in Australia. We've had cases reported in the Midwest. There were probably cases in the 30s and 40s in Missouri, Texas. I have a pretty well described elk mutilation case that was in 1949, some hogs in the 30s in Missouri. So, yeah, these cases, they have occurred, but at the time, they didn't really strike create a meme like the Snippy Case did. The Snippy Case really put this whole mystery on the map. I mean, reporters as far away as China were, contacting the ranching family. And, there were a bunch of cases in the mid to late 60s in Pennsylvania that John Keel and Ivan T. Sanderson investigated. There were cases in the early 70s. But what most people who have at least some knowledge of this whole thing, most often I hear people say, oh, well, it's aliens. And that's because for the past 30, 35 years, Linda Howe and other investigators have sort of put blinders on and have really, really cherry-picked the cases to support their conclusion that ETs are here gathering genetic material for hybridization programs and that sort of thing. And, when somebody comes to me and says that, I say, well, wouldn't it be easier just to pick the lock in a rendering plant? You'll have as much genetic material as you could possibly ever want.
Yeah. It
makes a lot more sense than going around out in the fields. And I say, well, why would the government, leave cows in the middle of the field? And it's because it's, my stock answer is, well, if they took the cows, it would be larceny. It'd be grand larceny in some cases. And the animal would be gone, and there'd be a stolen head of livestock report. And that's a pretty serious crime in the West, for instance. To leave it there, you have plausible deniability. And I often find that the stranger the case, the more bizarre some of the wounds, some of the circumstantial evidence around the animal, if it's highly bizarre, the rancher is much less likely to report it. It's cases where they see military-style helicopters, or they see what they think are some sort of occultist hooded figures. These are the types of cases that seem to, kind of tick off the ranchers, and they tend to, are more apt to report those. So it's in many ways, it's a self-nullifying mystery. You have the plausible deniability of the same parts of basically that are targeted by scavengers, oftentimes, predominantly are the parts that seem to be excised in the real cases. And so, the debunkers and skeptics say, oh, every cattle mutilation case is misidentified scavenger action. And I think, you've read most of the book, and I think you would agree with the statement that there are so many cases that we have proven, that science has proven, law enforcement has proven, without any shadow of a doubt, that were perpetrated by some sort of intelligence with extreme prejudice and with a lot of talent. Some of these cases are extremely difficult to explain away, and there is a body of scientific evidence that backs this up. Now, the Linda Howes and the people who are into this whole ET angle, which you can't factor that out. I'm not saying that couldn't possibly be an explanation, but I think it's the least likely explanation in my view. And if there are cases of this type, they're few and far between compared to the the vast majority of cases, which I think are done by human groups. The first thing I do when I go out on a case is I look to see if there's hair follicles that have been cut in a straight line. It doesn't matter what kind of insect, bird, predator, scavenger you are, you're not going to cut hair like with a sharp knife.
Right.
And if there's cut hair follicles, to me, that's an indication that somebody did that to that animal, or something with intelligence and with tools did that to the animal.
Well, why don't you tell people a little bit about the Snippy case? Now, first of all, the horse actually wasn't called Snippy. That was the father of the horse, right?
Yeah, the sire of the filly was named Snippy, and the press, kind of got the names mixed up, and the owners never corrected them because it was, kind of an appropriate name for a horse that ended up in the condition that it was found in. On September 7th, Snippy and several other horses were out in the San Luis Valley on the King Ranch. The next morning, Snippy didn't come in for feed and water, so they went out looking for him, and the ranch owner found the horse a quarter mile away from the ranch house in a kind of a damp meadow. And all the tissue, the hide, the muscles, the hair, the skin, the meat, all the connective tissue was vacuum cleaned from the tip of its nose down to its shoulders. A very unusual case. We've never had one like it before or since. The horse's tracks in one version of the story ended up almost 100 feet from where the animal was found. Strange kind of giant prints were found at the site. There was a piece of meat that was found on a piece of vegetation that when it was touched, it created like an acid-like burn on the hand of the horse's owner. A flying saucer, some sort of silver object, a round silver object, was seen by the grandmother a day or two before that. She didn't have her glasses on when she was doing the dishes, so she couldn't really get a good look at it, but she definitely saw something hovering over their corral. And there's even photographs that I've dug up that show, where the thing apparently sheared off the top of one of the fence corral posts. So the owner of the horse, Nellie Lewis, again, this is in September 67, based on some UFO reports that occurred around that time frame. And then later, there were quite a few of them. But that and her mother's, kind of, without her glasses sighting, she made the statement when news got out that flying saucers had killed her horse. And that really created a huge international news story. People, reporters from China, France, all over South America, they were inundated with requests for information, interviews. It hit the news, services and the Associated Press and the UPI and Reuters and all that. And it really became a really celebrated story. In fact, I remember as a 10-year-old kid staying in line at Safeway in Bellevue, Washington, where I was living growing up, and seeing this like world news, in National Enquirer type rag with this headline and this, awful looking photograph of this horse lying on the ground and people looking at it. And of course, I bugged my mom to give me a dime or 5 cents, however much it cost to buy the paper, and I devoured the story. And so I was exposed to the Snippy case, within a month or so, 5 weeks maybe after it happened. So, I kind of, that whole seed was planted early on. And when I moved to the San Luis Valley, I didn't move there because UFOs had been reported there. I didn't move there because Snippy, had died there. I moved there because I had friends that had a house, and it was a beautiful place, one of the most beautiful places I've ever lived. So, all this other stuff kind of came along. Got piggybacked on top of just trying to live a regular life and pay my bills, and put together the most kick-ass rock and roll band I could in the area, and so it's just been off to the races ever since. I've been on 70 TV shows and produced and even directed some national TV segments and field produced and helped develop programming for quite a number of shows over the years. And I do try to keep as an objective, dispassionate, unbiased view of this stuff. And I try to present the information as objectively as I possibly can. I don't factor anything out. I don't factor anything in. I'm intellectually honest. I don't put on blinders. I don't promote a particular pet theory. I really do attempt to do the analysis and allow the data to provide me with, the evidence to support any conclusions that I may come up with in this second book.
And you seem to be a true skeptic in that you're questioning everything. You're not
Yeah.
And that's refreshing to read, especially in a book like this that's so packed full of information. You're not doing what Linda Howe does and push a certain idea.
Right.
And it definitely adds to the weight of the material. And it's the ET thing. It seems like, we can't even prove there are extraterrestrials in the first place, much less that they're dissecting cows. And why would they do that anyway?
Right. In the percentage of cases that have, unusual lights that won't conform to conventional aerial activity or landing traces, or, there's just a handful of cases where actual landed craft have been seen, and 1 or 2 cases where entities have been seen. These cases are a vast minority. For one of those cases, there could be 1,000 of the other, really mundane, but very perplexing and high strange nonetheless, but appeared to be, done with sharp implements. People don't understand really. You gotta do your homework, and you really have to do your research, and you have to become up to speed on what happens to an animal in a particular environment during a particular time of year. What happens when it dies of, whatever it might be, poison plants, bad water, old age, maybe it's sick and taken down by a predator. And then what happens to it once it's dead? You really have to be up to speed to understand, the natural processes that do take place out on the range. 2% of all livestock die every year. Ranchers are around dead livestock all the time. They're very familiar with what happens when a pack of coyotes comes in and overnight just totally tears a carcass up and just devours it. They know when it's strange, when their own animals won't approach it, when the other cattle seem to be afraid of the sight, for instance. When there's been hundreds and hundreds of military helicopters that have been seen around these mutilation sites. And I mentioned that to Linda when I asked her to do an interview for the book, and she said, well, Chris, it's just UFOs masquerading as helicopters.
Which, of course, is possible.
It's not, of course, it's not out of the realm of possibility, but, Occam's razor here.
Yeah.
If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and if you shoot at it and it starts smoking, and there's quite a number of cases where the helicopters have shot back, including one case where they were shooting back at the ranch on the ground. Another team was on the ground. In 1972, for instance, before the mutilations became a big news story, there weren't mutilations being reported, let's say in Iowa. Hundreds of hogs and hundreds of dozens of cattle were being stolen. And these helicopters were associated, these mystery helicopters were associated with this rustling activity. And the vigilante patrols were being formed, and helicopters were being fired on. And it turned into a real kind of a nightmare for the utility companies with their, helicopters checking the power lines, or National Guard helicopters. They had to fly at extra high altitudes. And there was a bit of, kind of a vigilante sort of hysteria going on. And there was some concern that, conventional helicopter flights might inadvertently get caught up in this. So I find it very interesting that, other investigators who are more attached to, a high strain sort of off-planet explanation, they don't mention the cases where animals have been found killed with firearms, shot and then mutilated. They don't mention the cases where animals appear to have been, mutilated with sharp implements that don't have this, kind of pop culture, sort of cliche of laser cuts and cookie cutter incisions. And, those types of cases are pretty rare. And even cases that have been scavenged. Once the animal bloats, the area that's been cut or torn dries out, and then when the animal shrinks back down, those areas tend to become hard and dark and have a glistening sort of smooth, kind of shiny appearance, and it looks burnt to someone who doesn't know what they're looking at.
Right.
So a lot of these types of evidence, crime scene evidence, if you will, has been misinterpreted, and these terms have become part of the lexicon. And there's been a number of cases where I've gone out and the rancher said, "Oh, they drained this animal of blood." And if the animal died, let's say poison plants or some sort of natural attrition, and the blood pressure subsided, and then maybe it got scavenged by birds, or maybe some smaller animals. Even maggot blooms can scour the edges of what appear to be cuts. Gravity has a way of pulling all the fluids down into the body cavity. The moisture wicks out of it, and it loses its moisture, becomes pretty thick and gelatinous. But all you have to do is flip that thing over, and whoosh, out come all the blood and fluids that you can't see looking down at it from from an uninformed viewpoint. All you have to do is flip it over, and you'll find plenty of goodies.
But there are cases where they have been fully drained of blood.
There have been cases, yes, there have. I've had some, but out of the 200 I've had, I've only had 2. That maybe 3, 4. That the meat appeared to be grayish colored or light pink. It didn't have the robust red color. One case, the whole calf was totally drained of fluids, and the spine was gone. The right front leg was gone. Reproductive tract was reamed out. The brain was taken out of the skull with no break into the cranium. We only found 1 drop of blood, and this thing was in a brand fresh, spanking new 5 inches of snow, and we found 1 drop of blood on the left rear hoof. So that case would be an example of a high strange case. There were strange lights seen in the area, reported by 2 separate witnesses, unbeknownst to one another. That was, I do consider that to be the strangest case that I personally have ever investigated. But again, for every one of those, there's 100 just much more mundane cases that could be some sort of government group monitoring the environment. There's various explanations that have been proposed over the years to explain why anybody would want to do this. And one thing that I'm pretty sure of is it's not so much the head of livestock that's important, it's where it is in the environment. It's almost like, if these livestock are downwind and downstream, let's say, of where we utilize uranium, mine it, weaponize it, put it into power plants, put it into missiles. If you go downwind and downstream of these areas, oftentimes you'll find high incidence areas that have high numbers of mutilation cases. And, just the above ground, 100 above ground nuclear tests. If you look at maps of the spread of radiation through the weather systems, that correlates with areas of high incidence. Of course, then you have 3,000 plus cases in South America from 2002 to 2005. You have an outbreak of cases on the Canary Islands that couldn't be explained. There's been cases in Puerto Rico, strange cases in Australia. There have been weird horse slashing cases over the years, and sheep cases for hundreds of years in England. There were mutilated seals washing up in the Orkney Islands north of England in the North Sea. Dolphins washing up with identical wounds, dead on beaches in south of France. Thousands and thousands of domestic house cats that have been found. They look like they've been clipped in half by a giant pair of scissors, and the back end's gone. Yeah. Almost every urban center in Western United States has reported these cases. Even in Brentwood, in some of the most exclusive neighborhoods in California back in the early 70s, there was an outbreak of these strange half-cat deaths. So it's not only cattle, it's pigs, goats, sheep, bison, elk, deer. We've even had a case of a cow that was mutilated, and right next to it was a mutilated coyote, which is the only carnivore case that I've ever had. So this is a really complicated subject. It deserves an objective, dispassionate, treatment. And we really need to look at all possibilities. We can't factor anything out or in. And we have to allow the facts and, the data to lead us to any potential conclusions.
And tonight we've been talking with Christopher O'Brien about his new book, Stalking the Herd, dealing very thoroughly with the subject of cattle mutilations. And as you just said, they're not always cattle.
No.
And that's a little odd, too, I would say.
Well, when you look at it, it's not really that odd. There's the old adage, you are what you eat. We have been eating cattle for so many generations that cattle hemoglobin has been used routinely in war zones to as a replacement for human hemoglobin to get injured or wounded Army guys or whomever back to hospital areas. And it's a virtual genetic match to human hemoglobin. I think it's 99.9 to 9 places genetic match to human hemoglobin. Swine would be second, 99.9 to 7 places. A transfusion of swine hemoglobin would kill you. But if you're a universal donor, you could literally survive a transfusion of pure cattle hemoglobin. I think right now artificial human blood is patent pending, of course, based on cattle blood. So, we do have this symbiotic kind of incestuous, connection with cattle. And it's not by accident that I think cattle are the sizable majority of cases reported over the years, probably 90 plus percent of unexplained animal death cases are of cattle. It is a very perplexing mystery. There's a high burnout rate among people that have attempted to look into this particular mystery. There's quite a number of investigators who agreed to help me, but refused to comment publicly. They allowed me access to their data, but it's just so it's so frustrating to chase after something that's leaving thousands of pounds of physical evidence behind, and not get the help and not get the credibility needed to get science, get academics, get real diagnostic criminal laboratories involved. They have ebbed and flowed their involvement over the years, mostly in the 70s into the 80s, but now it's just a buzzkill, man. Somebody introduces you, he investigates cattle mutilations. I mean, that's the last thing you want to be introduced as. And, I just roll my eyes, and you just don't want to talk about this stuff. And it can be scary. This is some frightening territory. It's not like a ghost sighting where it's, dude, did you hear that? Or I just heard a Bigfoot smacking on a tree. I mean, that's all I think important in one sense of the word. But when you're dealing with a big burly rancher crying on your shoulder because they came down and mutilated his finest breeding cow, or took his seed bull, or melted his dogs out in the pasture, like the Sherman Ranch case, where they had a mutilation that occurred when the rancher and his wife were in the field, just a few hundred yards away. So there are some high strange cases, I think, that are separate from the majority of cases. I think these high strange cases may tie into our ancient practice of animal sacrifice, for instance. And I do go into that particular correlation to some degree in the book. And I think, though, as I mentioned before, there appears to be some sort of monitoring program going on. Mad cow disease may be possibly lurking in the food chain. That may be one of the motivating factors behind monitoring livestock in specific geographic regions. It gets into some pretty scary territory when you really dig into it and start bouncing off some of the data off of the trending and the patterning. It's enough to freak somebody out who's not grounded and really it doesn't have the ability to compartmentalize and sort of stand outside of this type of material. And I could name a whole list of people that have dropped away from the field. One investigator committed suicide. One, Tom Adams, disappeared 15 years ago. We only know of one person that's talked to him. Peter Jordan no longer will comment. Ted Oliphant, who's a police officer in Fife, Alabama, investigated dozens and dozens of cases. He'll no longer publicly talk about it. Philip Hoyle at the Animal Pathology Field Unit has been investigating sheep mutilations since the 90s in Wales and Western Britain. He is not involved anymore. The list goes on and on and on. And it's unfortunate that we don't get the kind of attention and respect and help that we need to get to the bottom of this. I mean, I just had a case reported 2 days ago. A bull and a bull calf were mutilated up on the Crow Indian Reservation, and in a very rare twist, the calf evidently survived. I guess it's now a steer, but it was a bull calf before the operation. Let's put it that way. So I'm in hopefully going to be in touch with some of the folks investigating those cases up in Montana. We had a case last year in western Nebraska that was really freaky. The animal was found mutilated, and its head was stuffed down a hole in the pasture. There have been some pretty freaky ones. We've had animals discovered in trees. They're pretty rare, but again, this is an area that doesn't get the amount of attention that it deserves.
Now, when they find them in trees and things like that, I mean, the belief is that they're being dropped. If helicopters or the government or some part of the government is involved, that would make sense. They could lift it up, drop it back down. But like in some cases, like you said, the farmer was out right in the field when it happened. Wouldn't they have seen something? Yeah,
or heard something. Yeah, that was very, very bizarre. And it happened up on the Skinwalker Ranch, as they call it. It's kind of a misnomer, but the Sherman Ranch, the rancher immediately, it's about 10 in the morning, he immediately called the National Institute for Discovery Sciences, who were in the process of acquiring the ranch. And a private jet flew up, a microbiologist, a veterinary pathologist, a crack team of scientists who did a on-site investigation within hours, and they were just horrified by this. We had a case down in a very interesting case that I haven't really dug completely into, but there's a number of interesting newspaper reports from South America of a giant 60,000-gallon stock watering tank, basically, that would water a whole herd of cattle. That was inexplicably drained overnight. Not one drop of water found anywhere. And, I think in one report it said 19 mutilated cattle were found inside the empty tank. We've had animals found 2 miles away in 3 pastures away from where they were last seen through lock gates and over fence lines. One animal was found, huge bull was found inside an abandoned adobe shack, and the darn thing couldn't have even gotten in there, even if it had tried to walk in there. We've had cases where, on the Sherman Ranch again, where he goes out and he's looking for his 9 seed bulls, and they're nowhere to be found, and he kind of hears scuffling, and inside a locked horse trailer, he found the animals, and there was still dust and cobwebs on the lock that was used to secure the door. So, there are a number of cases that really are high strange that there's no, possible prosaic answer for. And these are the cases that I think are the least likely to be reported by the ranching community. They basically, something like this happens, it's so freaky. So oftentimes they won't even tell their own family. They'll drag it off to a bone pile. They'll bury it with a backhoe. They'll out of sight, out of mind. And for many cases that I found out from neighbors, from friends that would hear about cases, or from law enforcement sources, and they'd tell me. And I'd just slowly start working on the rancher, and finally he would, I would call him and never ask him anything about the case. I just, ask him about the price of hay. What do you think about the local high school team's basketball tournament, and I'll talk to you later, and I call back up a few weeks later, and then finally they just blurt out, okay, I'll tell you. So I kind of have a weird reverse psychology that I use on these guys because, to be honest with you, this is scary stuff. These guys see dead animals all the time, and when they see something that they know is high strange, it's freaky. It really puts you in a place of fear. You worry about your family, you worry about your livelihood. And we don't have enough people that are concerned enough to help these people out in this country and other countries.
Why don't you tell people a little bit about the first case you investigated?
Oh, boy. Well, the first case that I went out to interview a rancher was probably the most important case in my process. During that initial 2 weeks when I was researching the article, I contacted the local Saguache County Sheriff. Officially, there had been no mutilations reported in Saguache to any of the investigative databases, that I had access to. And so I went to the sheriff, and he said he'd look into it. And he said, I'm not going to promise anything. We don't have files on murders that happened back then. So much to my surprise, a couple of days later, he showed up at my house and handed me a couple of dozen photographs. And Only 2 of the pictures had any writing on the back to indicate, whose ranch it was, dates or anything like that. And fortunately, the deputy who was the main investigator for all the cases was still around. So I was able to meet with him, and we slowly went through all the photographs and ID'd where they came from. And as it turns out, there are probably 30 or so cases in Swatch County that had never, officially made any sort of databases. So I picked out the one that was closest to me. And in January '93, I went out to the next town over in Moffat, Colorado, and visited the Sutherlands, who on June 6th, in 1980, they had a bull mutilated. And the night before, they'd been sitting down to dinner, and this helicopter buzzed right over their house. And then they heard it. They thought it disappeared, but then they heard it start up again like 20 minutes later, and it appeared to be about a mile south of their house out in their pasture. And so they ran outside to get a look at it, and this was, right after sunset, so there was still enough light to get a good look at it. And it flew directly over their house, less than 50 feet. It was a 1950s, late 40s, early 50s, like a U-47 Bell, whirlybird, like you see at the beginning of the show MASH. Mm-hmm. It was one of these antique, ancient helicopters, and it was painted this weird mustard yellow color and had no markings on it, and it flew back in the direction it had originally come from. And so they thought it was really strange, but they didn't think anything of it until the next morning. They went out to check on the animals, and they found their prize seed bull mutilated in the field. Well, 13 years later, of course, I have a picture of the bull in my hand, and I called up Virginia Sutherland and arranged for an interview and went out there. And she gave me, all the blow-by-blow description. I interviewed her son, and then I asked him to go out to the field, and sure enough, there was the bull still laying there. It was kind of melted into the field, and I took the skull home and ended up painting it. It's hanging on my wall. And so that, the next morning, I got up and was typing up my field notes, and, just sitting there in my shorts and, drinking a cup of coffee, and I hear this thump, 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 thump sound, and I look out my window, and in the same exact description of helicopter, an antique 40s, 50s UH-47 or U-47 flew right over my house, mustard yellow colored, just a totally bizarre, tricksterish coincidence, if you will. And I'll tell you, man, I kissed the tar baby that morning, boy. It's still stuck to my face. That just floored me. And I kind of had a sense right from that point on that we were dealing with something infinitely more complicated than the simple answer of aliens coming from other planets, that there was something way more complicated at work here.
Or even just government interaction, because some of this stuff, as far as we know, couldn't have been done by the government.
Yeah, not in 1602.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly.
06, rather. Yeah, so, I mean, there is a high, strange supernatural, if you will, preternatural. I have often kind of had a feeling that there's some sort of dimensional predator that as soon as that belly hits the ground, that animal's fair game for something. Maybe that's why when they slaughter kosher, when they have a Jewish ritual to slaughter animals, it's called the kosher process. They don't let the animal's belly hit the ground until it's dead and drained of blood. And there's some interesting parallels if you go around the world and look at certain ritualized behavior around the slaughtering of animals. There's over 1 million people in this country that slaughter animals routinely for religious purposes, mostly chickens, some sheep and goats,
right?
But and some ducks and other fowl. But I mean, it's a constitutionally protected religious practice of slaughtering animals and using their blood and body parts for ritualistic purposes. And this is something most Americans, they don't want to think about that stuff. I mean, it's like, all they want to know is if I go to the store, I can buy, some chopped meat that's on a piece of styrofoam wrapped in plastic. Right. I mean, I don't, out of sight, out of mind. I don't care where it comes from. I don't care how it got here. It tastes good. They keep the price down, and I haven't died from it yet. I mean, that's the basic attitude in the West. And unfortunately, if people really knew how that meat got to their supermarket, from the birth canal all the way through the raising and rendering and processing, and I think a lot of people would become vegetarians very quickly. 80% of the antibiotics used in the United States go into cattle.
Yeah.
A sizable majority of growth hormones go into cattle, chickens, swine. they're being kept in these horrific, huge, mega feedlots of 100,000 plus animals in places, striding around in their own filth. They have to try to get them out of that very unclean, unsanitary environment as quickly as possible. So they pump them full of grain, which they're not naturally supposed to eat. They're supposed to eat grass. So they use up to 1,700 pounds of grain to put 400 pounds of weight on them, pump them full of antibiotics to make sure that they don't get sick from walking around in their own feces and urine. And then they want the animal to grow as quickly as possible, so they pump it full of growth hormones so they can get it out of that feedlot, put it into the processing chain, and send it out. The beef industry in this country is one of the most powerful forces politically in this country, and you'll never hear about them unless you're Oprah. And back in the late 90s, when she did a show on mad cow disease and made the comment, "I'll never eat another hamburger again," she was instantly slapped with a $2 billion lawsuit.
Wow.
And it took her $1 million to beat it, but $1 million is $1 million. So, the beef lobby is one of those real kind of super low key, sort of under the radar political forces. It's the largest single section of agriculture. Back in the 1890s, when they tried to do the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up people think they were trying to break up Standard Oil or the railroads or this, that, or the other thing. No, they were trying to break up the beef industry, the beef packers, Cudahy, Swift, Armour. So this is an area that really gets into some it's a sticky area, and it gets into some political intrigue. I find it interesting that 70 to 80% of the ranches that were around in the 70s when these cases were hot and heavy are all out of business now. And I have cases where it looks like rich ranchers with lots of land have been trying to drive smaller ranchers, their neighbors, out of business, using the mutilation phenomenon as an intimidation tactic, for instance.
Yeah.
Linda and other investigators aren't going to even address these cases. And I've got a case with 2 county sheriffs, not one, but 2, publicly named a rancher as aiding and abetting and helping helicopter crews who were responsible for mutilating hundreds of animals down in southern Colorado.
Yeah. You're on WVBR FM Ithaca. You're listening to Where Did the Road Go? We're talking to Christopher O'Brien for a little bit more here on part 1 of this conversation about cattle mutilations and such. Wow, the thing is, it's so mind-boggling because you talk about that, how they're aiding these crews, and where are these crews coming from, and why would they need to be aided if they were, say, a government group, or
or they could hire some guys, man.
Yeah.
Just think in 1975, how many returning Vietnam veteran helicopter pilots were back, being put into the job market. There was a lot of helicopters flying around in those days, and a lot of people that were certified to fly them. And it doesn't take much of a stretch to think that maybe that there were some teams that were either employed by quasi governmental groups like the CDC or the NIH, National Institute of Health, or Centers for Disease Control, if it was concerned about mad cow disease, for instance, or other groups that may or may not have had some occult leanings. There's been a number of cases over the years that have had these strange ritual occult sign left behind. I had a number of them. These are cases that most investigators will not even talk about. That and ritual blood sacrifice. Just I'm probably one of the only people on the planet that really has been digging into this whole potential angle. And there is a body of evidence, and there are cases that do have a veneer of ritual occult magic to them. And I don't care who you are, you're going to have a hard time arguing with the facts. And there's a ton of facts in my book.
Yes,
your book figures trying to close down highways and stuff, and carrying torches and bizarre stuff.
At the same time, could that be a cover for whoever's really doing it to throw off the?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, red herring cases, I think, are a significant number of cases. It seems like real cases occur. They tend to be the highest strange cases. Then you have an outbreak of very slick human perpetrated cases in and around those initial areas. Then you have red herring cases that are spread around the region to keep, and I think it's to keep investigators running around, not focusing on the important cases that seem to occur at the beginning of a wave.
So if they're checking, I guess if the government's checking environmental factors, why wouldn't they just buy a cow from someone, or why would they do it this way rather than...
They do. And they rent pasture and they raise their own cattle and other livestock.
So why would they need the mutilation cover?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of these areas that mutilations occur tend to be where patriotic militia group types hang out. And a lot of, some of the areas where you have your biggest concentration of chronic wasting disease, which is mad cow disease in deer and elk. The areas where these herds are found tend to be the herds that militia groups and patriot members tend to hunt in. So, I mean, you can look at this from several different angles here. There could be some societal and political manipulation going on as a part of the overall program. I'm not saying that is the end-all to be-all explanation, not by any stretch. But you can accomplish a lot just by simply killing and disfiguring a head of livestock and leaving it there. It sends a lot of messages, and especially in remote rural areas, ranching communities tend to be more conservative. They tend to be more well-armed, more patriotic, more prone to organize and have issues with the government. Just look at the recent Bundy Ranch fiasco. And, we're not even beginning to talk about some of the scientific results. I mean, we found potassium chloride, mescaline, nicotine, all sorts of barbiturates, ketamine, anticoagulants have been found when they do necropsies and do workups on mutilated cattle. So there's a lot, animals that have been shot and then mutilated. Correct me if I'm wrong, but aliens don't normally go around firing 30-06s. Or
not that we know about.
Yeah, or injecting nicotine or mescaline into an animal.
It's, it's one of these things where you feel like you're going down the rabbit hole. The more you look into it.
Oh, yeah. No, you're down the rabbit hole, baby. You just wonder when the rabbit hole's going to end. It doesn't seem to end very quickly.
No, and also when you're talking about the environmental factors, like, for instance, you cite in 1972, there were no mutilations at all. But in 1975, there were so many cases. Why? Is there a correlation there to something that's going on?
Yeah, it's funny. There were no mutilations, but there were hundreds of animals being stolen.
Okay, that was in 72.
Yeah, and in 73, you had one of the largest UFO waves ever, and the places where there were helicopter sightings had no UFO sightings.
And there have been some cases where the helicopters have morphed into UFOs.
That's only one or two that I know of.
And I think John Keel also brings up the...
I have footage of a helicopter morphing into a silver orb. It's because the sun's hitting it at the perfect angle on the round canopy, and the light bloom makes it appear like it's a silver orb going across the screen. So, appearances can be deceiving.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
I have great footage of that very, very, effect.
And John Keel also talked about early on some cases of like ghost planes and ghost helicopters that made no noise. And this was before we supposedly had this type of technology.
Right.
So, I mean, that could factor in somewhere because something has to explain some of these high strangeness cases somewhere along the line.
Right. The Alexander Hamilton, the 1897 Yates Center, Kansas case where the great airship lassoed his calf and drug it off. He was the justice of the peace of the county. And ended up, telling everybody about it. And then he resigned as a law officer. And Jerome Clark, years later, obviously in the 70s here, claimed, he was part of a liars club and all this. And I had found no evidence to back up Clark's assertions. In fact, I found more evidence to suggest that the case was real.
Yeah. And that's, again, just more down that rabbit hole. All right. So we're going to have you back in I believe, June.
Okay.
And we're going to cover the other half of all of this, getting some details on some of the years and some of the other stuff going on, and some of the other possibilities of what might actually be going on and what it might be connected to. Do you want to tell people a little bit where can they get the books?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, Amazon's going to have it, but if you want a signed copy, I'm only signing 1,000 copies, and they're all signed and numbered. You can go to Our Strange Planet, one word, Our Strange Planet. It's a strange planet. It's Our Strange Planet.com. I also have a dedicated site, Stalking the Herd. I'll go ahead and sign it and shoot it off to you. obviously Barnes and Noble, any sort of major bookstore in your town. Obviously on Amazon you can find it, and also listen to the Paracast. Paracast.com, TheParacast, theparacast.com. We've been around 8 years. We're a heavy-hitting, hard question show. We try to make some of our guests with extraordinary claims squirm a little bit. And we have a lot of fun doing it. And all our shows are archived at our website at theparacast.com.
And I'll have to say, I've only started listening in the last few months to the show, but I greatly enjoy it. You guys do an excellent job.
Thank you.
And all right, so we will have you back in June, and we'll continue discussing a little bit of this, and maybe we'll get through the rest of the stuff I want to talk to you about.
Okay.
Because I still have a long list here.
Once you finish chapter 12, I think you're going to have a ton of questions.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Christopher.
Yeah, you're welcome, man. Thanks for having me on.
On to part 2 of our interview with Christopher O'Brien. You're with us, Chris.
Yes.
And we had you on a month ago talking about your new book, Stalking the Herd, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery. It's a very epic book, running almost 600 pages, and 551 to be exact, I guess, not counting the pictures at the end. And it is probably, I would say it is the most comprehensive book ever written on this very puzzling phenomenon. I assume that's what you were going for.
Pretty much. Figure I'd take all the mud that I could find, throw it against the wall, see what sticks.
All right. Well, one of the things, we talked about the basis of the mystery and such a month ago, so let's get on to some of the other stuff. One of the things I noticed between the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, which you break the chapters up through, there seems to be an evolution of this phenomena to some extent, with certain things staying the same. Can you explain that evolution a little bit?
Well, I'm not sure if I can explain it, but I can kind of throw out there for the audience some of the, I guess, trends and patterns that seem to emerge from the data. Essentially, the beginning of the 70s, before this whole mystery became a front page headlines and part of the cultural memeplex, if you will, there were quite a number of back in 72, there were quite a number of rustling cases that featured mystery helicopters. And it seems that before this thing really blew out wide open in 75 through 79, which were the peak years for the mystery, where thousands of animals were being reported in a mutilated condition. Prior to that, in 72, in Iowa, Kansas, parts of Nebraska, we had waves of cattle rustling and hog rustling, which I found very intriguing. It's almost like they tried one way of doing this and realized that by stealing the animals, it just created a fervor among the ranching communities in these areas that were being targeted. And so it seems like in 74, late 70, the fall of 74, we see a switch to actually leaving animals back on the ranches where they had been targeted. And at this point, we're not really sure whether these animals are being taken somewhere, experimented on and returned, or whether they're actually being experimented on in the field somehow or in the pasture. And in the 70s, I think we see what appears to be a correlation with a proximity to where we mine uranium. There's like this weird nuclear element that seems to be there. Nuclear power plants, missile bases with nuclear warheads, weapons labs where we enrich uranium. If you go downwind and downstream of these locations, those are the regions that are the hardest hit during the 70s. And I think that's it's an example of what could be called the environmental monitoring theory, which my mentor David Perkins kind of arrived at in late 78, early 79. He kind of noticed this correlation. And then he also mapped in areas that were hardest hit with the above ground radiation from 100 or so above ground nuclear tests that were conducted in the Nevada test site. And if you look at maps of the dispersion of radioactive materials, basically, there's almost a perfect match with the areas hardest hit by mutilation teams. And so that's the 70s. And then in the 80s, we see it morph into something else. We may be dealing with an expanded agenda, or even a whole separate, possibly third, fourth agendas that emerge. This is when we first start seeing cases of animals that appear to be microwave. animals would die for no apparent reason. A vet would be called. He'd open up the animal and find that the animal was cooked on the inside, almost like it had been microwaved. And of course, these are just a number of cases that we can really point to. This is not in any way, shape, or form a one-size-fits-all answer for 80s cases, but we are seeing these types of postmortem testing results in the 80s that we didn't see in the 70s. And toward the end of the 80s, we also see what could be some sort of monitoring of other environmental pollutants, let's say, in the environment, downstream from Superfund sites where there's a lot of heavy metals in the water, for instance. And then into the 90s, we may be seeing some sort of bacteriological weapons testing. Down in Fife, Alabama, Ted Oliphant was a police official down there. And, out of the 80 or so cases, 80, 90 cases that he investigated, he seemed to see some sort of connection with Fort Campbell and other bases down in the southeast that may have been involved, sending out helicopter teams that were suspected of being involved in many of these cases. So, we do see kind of an evolution through the decades. But there's no real, until we really get a chance to knuckle down and fine-tooth comb through the data and really do a full analysis of just this bewildering amount of data, it's going to be difficult to come to any real strong conclusion. But like I said, we do see trends, we do see some patterns, and the next book that's going to be the analytical side of Stalking the Herd, it's going to be a complete analysis of the data from the first book, and we're hoping to see some some pretty interesting results kind of emerge out of the data.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about some of the other oddness around this. It's when you say cattle mutilations, it's not just cattle. I mean, obviously the first reported one that made it famous was Snippy the horse, but there's also been one of the things you mentioned, like rabbit mutilations, where they take the head but they leave the ears and the body. Cat.
Well, yeah, the cat mutilations. There's been thousands of those. They're really super bizarre and spooky, for lack of a better word. There's been thousands of these types of cat deaths reported around the West in most of your major metropolitan areas.
And this is where the cats are just literally cut in half.
Yeah, like with a giant pair of scissors. And oftentimes it's a domestic cat that just happens to sneak out one night and they find it in the front yard or backyard clipped in half the following morning.
And that just makes it that much weirder.
Yeah, exactly.
And so basically, it's tons of different animals. Dogs have been mutilated. What else have you encountered?
Well, sheep, goats, hogs, horses, cattle, bison, elk, deer, pretty much any warm-blooded animal. I did have a case with a cow and a mutilated coyote right next to it. That was pretty strange. We've had seals, dolphins. There have been cases, allegedly cases of people, although, the data on that's very sparse because those are the least likely cases that will be reported. But pretty much any warm-blooded animal, generally herbivores, you don't normally see carnivores being reported in this condition. We had a very strange case in the 70s where a wallaby was reported mutilated in a Southampton, England zoo, and then 3 months later, a number of wallabies were reported mutilated in the Jackson, Mississippi zoo. So you even have animals like wallabies that have been reported in this condition, which is pretty disconcerting.
Yeah, and it doesn't narrow down any particular explanation either.
No. In fact, it just makes it all that much more difficult to figure out, I guess.
And now, on the other hand, you've had cases where things like someone found a gas mask. There was a really weird one with chaff from an airplane and other different evidence. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, as we talked about in part one, it's very, very rare to find any sort of crime scene evidence, tire tracks, cigarette butts, footprints, that sort of thing. Oftentimes the tracks of the animal aren't even present. This is actually a fairly regular occurrence. It's really rare, to find any sort of evidence. We've had a Army issue scalpel was found in one case, of a leaves with a cow ear, and I think a scalpel was found in the driveway of a rancher who was near a mutilation site. The Dulce the Gomez Ranch cases featured tripod marks on the ground that looked like something landed there. The rancher went into town to get the New Mexico State Patrolman. When he came back, there were even more tracks. This was in broad daylight. Gabe Valdez, the head of the New Mexico State Patrol stationed in Dulce there, he found a gas mask at once. They found some sort of Air Force, a piece of Air Force, some sort of meter, I think for an altimeter type meter. I forget exactly what its function was, but that was found. Radar chaff has been found, in one case stuffed into the cow's mouth.
Yeah.
But again, these are real standalone, very, very rare standalone cases. For every one of those, there's 1,000 that are head scratches with no evidence left behind.
Right, and wasn't there one with like a handprint or something in paint?
Yeah. There's been some cases like that. We've also had cases with ritual sign. There was a case in Colorado that had a melted candle on the skull of a mutilated cow, and the actual parts that had been excised were in a plastic bag hanging from a tree right over the animal. That's one of the rarest types of occult tinged cases. We found law enforcement has found ritual occult sign at a couple of cases, but nearby in a number of cases. Early on in the 70s, one of the predominant theories that was promoted by ufologists of all people were that these were ritual magicians like Satanists or some sort of occult group was going around involved in this. And I kind of got the sense, researching how this particular meme started, that it was some pretty prominent ufologists, J. Allen Hynek, Jerry Clark, and others, that were trying to disassociate the mutilation phenomenon from the UFO mystery. And so, they inadvertently, I think, kind of jump-started the whole idea that ritual occultists were involved. And this kind of snowballed and became a memo that was sent out by, I think, the FBI around to, quite a number of law enforcement agencies around the country. And so this particular, bee was thrown in law enforcement's bonnet, and it kind of buzzed around a bit. And it had the effect of, kind of prejudicing, it sort of steered law enforcement's thinking in that direction, which then kind of overlaid into media coverage. So it wasn't, it wasn't an unusual thing to read a newspaper article that said Satanist strike again, cow discovered mutilated, or, having that kind of ritual occultist angle thrown in. However scant the evidence was to support that particular theory, there have been cases that do kind of tend to suggest that, but again, they're extremely rare compared to your standard classic mute, where nobody sees anything, nothing is left behind, there's no cause of death. They can't figure out why the animal was disfigured in the manner that it was. So those are the cases by far that are the vast majority. These other cases, let's say UFO landed on the ground with little entities seen around a cow. There's only been one or two of those. So, you have to look at the predominance of the data and draw your conclusions based on the mass of data as opposed to singling out individual cases.
Right. And it seems when looking through the different decades, it almost seems like the 80s had a little less high strangeness than the other decades for some reason. Maybe it was just the way I was reading it, but it seemed like there were more, that stuff pointed more to like a government involvement and less really weird cases. Would you say that's accurate?
In which decade do you notice that?
In the 80s.
Yeah, the 80s. Well, you have to remember the Kenneth Rommel, the ex-FBI bank robber expert who had retired and was hired by the district attorney of Santa Fe, New Mexico, to do. It was kind of a report on the mutilations to try to placate the ranching communities who were really up in arms at that time. This would have been in 79. This is right after Harrison Schmitt, the senator for New Mexico, had a conference in Albuquerque trying to bring law enforcement and investigators together. Of course, Harrison Schmitt was the last man to walk on the moon. He was the senator from New Mexico, and he was getting petitioned by the ranchers, by law enforcement to do something. So he started by having this conference, and it turned into a circus. There were UFO true believers walking around in white robes, and I mean, it really was a zoo, and several law enforcement officials who refused to participate. And some of the ranchers got pretty upset that there were more UFO people there than serious, cattle death investigators. So on the heels of that, then you have the following 6 months, you have Kenneth Rommel, this FBI guy, conducting a study of this. He investigated several dozen cases, but at that point, I think I can speak for other investigators, and especially Gabe Valdez, there were no real high-strange cases that deserved investigation all through that 6 to 8 month time period where he was running around trying to find fresh cases to study. And so basically the cases that he did study were misidentified scavenger action, hence he debunked the whole thing. Similar to the Condon report that was commissioned by, I think, the University of Colorado back in the late 60s.
Right.
It was a similar kind of scenario where, with the Condon committee, Condon made statements before he even began that he was going to close the door on this thing and show that it was all a bunch of BS to begin with. And Rommel made similar statements to people before he even began his investigation. So there seems to have been agendas attached to both of those efforts. And as a result of that report coming out saying there's nothing to see here, move along, and about a year and a half, 2 years later, the release of a book called Meat Evidence, which again was a pretty self-serving debunking of the whole phenomenon, saying no, it's all just scavengers. That had the effect of dampening down law enforcement's willingness to come forward and dovetail their efforts investigating these claims with other law enforcement. And it had the effect of keeping ranchers quiet because they realized by this point that by reporting the case, the only thing that was going to happen was that they were going to bring all this glare of publicity down on themselves. And so they, instead of reporting the cases, it seems like for the most part, they would just drag them off to a bone pile or bury them with a backhoe or burn them and not tell anybody so that they could avoid any sort of, media attention and, the invariable circus that often sprang up around some of these cases. So we see a dampening down of the actual reporting of cases. And it's important to know, and it's important for me to stress here that pretty much I've found over the 20 plus years that I've been involved in this type of work that the higher strange the case, the more bizarre it is, the freakier it is, the less likely it is for the rancher to report it. It's when he sees, helicopters or maybe strange, hooded figures or something out of the ordinary around his ranch that puts him in a place of fear for his livelihood, for his family, and gets him angry. Those are the cases that tended to be reported, and still today, I think for the most part, those are the cases that are reported most often. Rarely do you have a super high strange case that is reported, I think, in this day and age.
All right. Speaking of high strangeness, one of the things I saw here and there is that occasionally these things are found in crop circles.
Well, only two to my knowledge. One was a horse that was like, there was a squashed porcupine in one.
And
wasn't really mutilated. I think it was just, it just happened to be in the wrong place at the right time.
And did you say the quills were swirled in the same direction as the grain?
Correct, yeah. The swirls were mimicking the lay pattern of the crop.
Which is really bizarre. What's your thoughts on the crop circle phenomena?
Well, I came up with an interesting correlation that ties in with the possible involvement of the subject of mad cow disease in this whole mystery.
Okay.
In 1986, the first crop circle with any sort of complexity was discovered at Cheesefoot Head in the early to mid-summer of 1986. And it was a circle. Up until that point, crop circles were just simple circles flattened down in fields.
Right.
And this was the first one that had anything extra, and it was a thin ring that went around the outside of the circle. And it was right during this approximate time period, within a week or two, that mad cow disease was first reported as occurring in England, very near where this crop circle was discovered. And for the next 10 years, you see the gradual sweeping through the countryside of mad cow disease, and you see a process of complexity that was unfolding in the crop circle, formations. And at the height of the crop circles, when the Julius set was laid down, which is one of the most, I think, bizarre and celebrated of all the crop circles, this was formed in broad daylight in less than 45 minutes. It was a huge formation that wasn't there when a pilot flew over in the morning. When he flew back about an hour or so later, a little less than an hour later, there was this big, huge formation in the field. And right when that one was laid down, which I think was a genuine formation, a vast majority of crop circles now, I think, are hoaxes and man-made. They're works of art, really. But in 98, when this particular Julia set was laid down, and it does have quite a bit of interesting, high strange documentation surrounding it. This was right as England was finishing up the cremation, the slaughtering and cremation of 4.5 million head of cattle. Every head of cattle in the British Isles was destroyed and cremated because of mad cow disease. So I you talk about crop circles and the mutilations. I find it very interesting that you should have a correlation with the most horrific of diseases, that we have yet, discovered in cattle, and that would be transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, which is 100% fatal. They call it now prion disease. And I think that there's a connection between the monitoring of the environment vis-a-vis through cattle mutilations and the possible monitoring of, God forbid, the spread of mad cow disease through the food chain. And that would be a really good rationale for targeting cattle in specific geographic regions to find out if mad cow disease is somehow emerging in the food chain.
Wouldn't that be just as easy to do, though, at a slaughterhouse or something like that?
Well, and that's true. But, remember when mad cow disease broke out in 1986, we didn't really have the complete centralization of the cattle, industrial cattle complex, if you want to call it that. It wasn't until later into the late 80s and into the 90s that you have the real consolidation of big agro creating these huge super feedlots and rendering operations. This is a fairly recent development in the cattle industry. So, and I also find it very interesting that the areas now that service these giant feedlot areas, feedlot operations and rendering plants, are some of the areas that were hardest hit during the mutilation waves of the 70s. And now, instead of small independent ranches in the area, you have a single super, operation. 70 to 80% of small ranching operations that were in business in 1975, when there were more cattle in North America than at any other time before or since, almost 80% of the ranchers are out of business now. And in their place are these giant industrialized rendering operations.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that there could have been a conspiracy to maybe scare some of these smaller groups out of the area.
Well, that's a possible explanation that I've seriously entertained. I had a case in the San Luis Valley where two county sheriffs fingered a particular rich rancher who had appropriated one of the two commons areas in the country. The Boston Common is the most famous, but this La Sierra Common in Costilla County was this huge swath of land in the foothills of the Sangres that belonged to the entire community. And this guy wrangled private ownership in the early 60s. And by the 70s, he was trying to buy out his neighbors. And isn't it interesting that there was incredibly hard hit? One of his closest neighbors lost 49 head, either shot, stolen, or mutilated in a 2-week period in October 75. So these two county sheriffs went on the record with me and said that they were absolutely convinced that this particular rancher was somehow aiding and abetting helicopter crews that were being associated with these waves of mutilations. And they made no bones about it. They came right out and stated publicly that, John Taylor was responsible. He was somehow involved with these waves of mutilations that were occurring there in Costilla County.
Okay. And the work of, and hopefully I'll get his last name right, Ted Oliphant, is that right?
Correct.
And he had theories about the military bases being involved, and was actually able to track some of the helicopters, wasn't he?
Yeah, correct. Back to, I think, Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
And there was, and when these bases were questioned, they just denied knowing anything about it, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's pretty much to be expected when you try to approach government officials, especially in the military. And Ted was pretty convinced that they were somehow conducting, biological warfare experiments and possible bio war games on unsuspecting ranches' cattle, which that's pretty mean.
Well, yeah.
And people say, well, Chris, how come the government doesn't get their own cows and do their own experiments, on their own? Well, they do. There's quite a bit of evidence that shows that the government does rent pasture, buy animals from ranchers in areas that they're interested in. But obviously there's an overriding agenda that I think is even more important, that somehow is supplemented by these clandestine cases that are being perpetrated on private property and to private individuals' herds.
Now, Ted, and I should say, Chris's book is Stalking the Herd, your latest book, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery. It is your 5th book?
Well, 6th, but who's counting? 5th published book.
Okay, all right. And what's the 6th?
Say again, I'm sorry?
What is the 6th book?
It's a biography that the guy who it's about hasn't allowed me to publish it yet.
Ah, okay. And you have another book coming out that was originally part of this book as well.
Correct, yeah. This book was 600 pages if you count the forward in the introduction. And as a result of having such a huge book, I decided to take out about 300 pages. The book was looking to be about a 900-page to a 1,000-page book. And my publisher, it's a 1995 book, so he's not going to make much money. Plus, it already almost weighs 2 pounds, so shipping it's pretty expensive as well. So what I did was I took an entire chapter of interviews, an entire chapter of analysis out, and I'm going to use that information and supplement it with a complete data analysis of the first book. So the next book is going to be an analysis, basically, of the first book.
All right. Any idea when that's going to be out?
I'm still working on researching it. It'll be co-authored with David Perkins. It's being worked on, but we're really digging into some of these connections between the TSE, mad cow, and the effect of radiation on areas where cattle are being impacted by environmental radiation. And there is the possibility that this type of condition, environmental conditions, can help kick off prion disease. And we're digging into the role of copper in blood and how that may be factored in here. It seems the less copper you have, the less likely you are as a cow to develop prion disease. The more copper, the more likely you are or the more susceptible you are to go full blown. So there's a lot of information. There's a lot of science that we're having to dig through. And I'm enlisting the help of some experts to assist us in this. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a veterinary pathologist. I'm not a biochemist. And so, we really want to do this correctly and not be alarmist or leave any sort of loose ends. We really want to have the analysis as tight and as pardon the term, scholarly as possible.
Okay. And I think that's exactly what this phenomenon needs. And it seems like it's near an impossible job, really, in some respects, because it's so all over the place. One of the things you mentioned in the book is someone actually had been marking the cows or looking for marks on the cows to see if they could find cattle that would be mutilated later.
Yeah, that was Howard Burgess, who was one of the independent investigators that was involved with Gabe Valdez up on the Gomez Ranch in Rio Ribas County, New Mexico, which is right around the Dulce area, around the Hickory Apache Reservation. And Howard and Gabe came up with this idea of creating a cattle chute at night and using various intensities and wavelengths of ultraviolet light to actually look at the backs of cows, because if they were being spotlit from the air, then obviously you'd want some sort of way to ID the animals that you were interested in. So they led them underneath a series of ultraviolet lights, and a number of them did have fluorescing markings on them. And when they went back to recheck them a few days later, all the markings were gone.
Huh.
Now, that's the only case that I know of where that type of process had been enacted by investigators. There have been a number of cases that have a little bit of fluorescing material that's been noted by veterinary pathologists when they examine animals. There was 1 or 2 cases where it seemed like some sort of fluorescing material was on the hair. But again, certain types of paint, certain chemicals, even some plants can leave behind materials that fluoresce under the proper lighting conditions. So, we're not really sure that this is, some sort of fairly consistent MO or anything by no stretch. But that's one of the things in my cattle mutilation doctor bag, if you will, is a small ultraviolet light that I go ahead and shine on cattle. I try to create as much darkness as I can. Generally, I'm there during the day, so get under a tarp and try to read the hide and see if there is any fluorescing material. I have yet to find any on any of the cases that I've investigated.
Oh, all right. In the stranger category, you want to talk a little bit about Larry Williams and his missing bear?
Oh, that's a bizarre case. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's a weird one, boy. In the northern end of the San Luis Valley, in the Sangre de Cristos, there's, if you go right over the Sangres into the Huerfano Valley, and pretty high up too, he was way up, I think above 9,000 feet. There was a guy that was living there, kind of a survivalist type. He had a pet bear. He ran cattle. He had a bizarre experience where something came down and he was in his truck and it literally lifted his truck and set it aside out of its tracks. And he started missing animals. And coincidentally, up and over the Sangres, directly west of him, animals were being found mutilated. Nobody knew whose animals they were. So these animals were coming out of nowhere. Of course, Williams didn't know his animals were being found on the other side of, 12, 13,000 foot mountains.
Right.
And the other rancher didn't know whose cows they were. I don't know if they were branded. The two never figured out that the others existed until much later. But he claimed at one point that they whoever these crews were, and there's some confusion. I mean, he saw everything from helicopters to UFOs to all sorts of aerial activity, but he kind of was pretty insistent that it was someone aboard some of these aerial craft had abducted his pet bear. So that's a pretty interesting case. It gets really involved. There's a lot of ins and outs on it. Unfortunately, one of our civilian investigating organizations kind of messed up on the case and used his name without permission and didn't handle the anonymity and proprietary information properly. And so he clammed up and was unwilling to talk further to investigators. It was an open case when he just totally shut everything down on us. He felt that he had been victimized as well, that he was missing time. He ended up with some very uncomfortable rectal warts that came out of nowhere that his doctor couldn't explain. Just some very bizarre stuff. So, careful what you wish for. You might want to live up in a nice, beautiful, pristine area, but, just, watch your ass, I guess. That's the only way I could put it. That is a bizarre case. It's one of the more bizarre cases that I've ever actually, in this case, been peripherally involved with, because I only talked to him a couple times. He was pretty upset at the local, UFO group investigators that showed up and started spinning his story in all different directions.
One of the things that has been brought up, and not because of your work, but in this other case, I'm sure you're familiar with the Dyatlov Pass incident in Russia.
Yeah.
Where they also had their tongues removed, their eyeballs removed, and things like that. Have you ever looked to see if there was any obvious connection there?
No, I haven't. Because of this recent mockumentary that came out, and of course, I've heard of the case, but I didn't know about some of the medical conditions, conditions that the people were found in, or the cadavers were found in. So that's a case that I definitely want to look further into. Russia is a place that has a lot of livestock in it, and I'm surprised that we haven't seen more cases come out of there. We have had some cases. I think about 2005 to 2010, there were a number of sheep and goat cases that seemed to be similar to the cattle mutilations, not as involved, not as methodical. And of course, as the media is wont to do, these animal deaths are blamed on chupacabras.
Right.
It's an interesting cross-cultural leap, I would say.
Well, it seems like these things have been blamed on everything down the line. And obviously, the thing that seems to stand out the most to me is that there's people doing it. It doesn't seem to point to aliens or monsters or anything like that. It does seem to point to people, more or less, like you said, whether it's an environmental thing or not. But some of this stuff is so hard to explain. At what level beyond what we know of our current technology would we have to be at to be able to do some of this stuff?
Well, Dr. John Andrews from the, I think, Iowa State Veterinary Lab, one of the top vets. I mean, the guy writes, textbooks. He is one of the top veterinary pathologists in the country. He was back in the early 80s. And he took a fresh calf that had been discovered mutilated and was literally still warm when they packed it up and took it to the college lab. And he put it on a table, and he took a recently dead calf and put it on a table next to it. And he attempted to duplicate the cut. And he said that he had extreme difficulty duplicating the cut around the eye and also the removal of the tongue from deep in the esophagus. He said that they literally needed a machine, kind of a vice to open up the animal's mouth wide enough to be able to get in there and able to do a straight cut, that's perpendicular to the tongue. He said that, I'm a pretty darn good surgeon, and I had a real rough time doing that. And he said it's inconceivable to him that anyone without his, advanced skill could even do that in, a well-lit laboratory scenario, as opposed to, being out in a field in the dark with no electricity, no lights. It was pretty hard for him to explain this. And he said there's just no way that this could have been done by any sort of scavenger or predator. He said that's totally, you just rule that out instantly because of the condition of the animal. And this is something that we do find. We do find that there are cases that are extremely difficult for humans to perpetrate. I'm not saying that they're impossible, but, we're talking, world-class skill in order to perpetrate a number of these cases over the years. And there is a line, I think, that you get to that once you get beyond that line, a human perpetrator is not really a viable explanation. I think we are dealing with something supernatural, high strange. It could be ETs. It could be some sort of dimensional predator. It could be time travelers coming back from the future with real high-tech technology. There is some sort of, magical, it's what Arthur C. Clarke said, any sufficient level of technology beyond ours would appear as magic. Well, that's the kind of scenario that we see. But what's important is that we're looking at thousands of pounds of physical evidence. And I really think that we should exhaust all diagnostic, complete diagnostic involvement in trying to ascertain, number one, how these things are being done, and number two, obviously, what is the agenda? Why are these animals being subjected to such cruelty? And one of the things that I've always championed is that this is a location specific phenomenon. It's where the animal is grazing, I think, is a key element here. That's why the government doesn't do all this type of testing at the Dugway Proving Grounds or at Fort Detrick, the Army Chemical Corps in Maryland. They need to do this and to monitor specific environmental elements in regions that they're interested in for whatever reason. So I think it's a location-specific phenomenon. I think the vast majority of cases can be explained as either misidentified scavenger action or the ones that are perpetrated with purpose by humans. But then you have that, the extreme high strange cases like the Sherman Ranch case that we mentioned, I think, in part one, where the rancher was literally in the field when this animal was attacked and torn apart. He was 300 yards away in broad daylight, didn't hear or see a thing. We've had other cases where we have less than a 10-minute window where people were standing right where a cow was discovered mutilated minutes later. So there are a number of cases that just really kind of make you scratch your head and go, what the heck is going on here? Who are these guys?
And the Sherman Ranch, that's also known as the Skinwalker Ranch, right?
Correct.
And that's also where they found the bulls stuffed inside of a trailer that hadn't been opened in ages, right?
Right. Well, the bulls were alive. Yeah, they weren't mutilated. But yes, the bulls were discovered crammed into a horse trailer. And there was still cobwebs and dust on the lock, like it hadn't been opened in months. So go figure that one out. It's like they were teleported in there. But of course, that's also the same place where they saw humanoid figures with dog heads leaning up against trees smoking cigarettes. So, all bets are off about what's going on up at that particular place. I was the first investigator up there, by the way.
Really?
Some people don't know that. Yeah. I was called in just as the article was being finalized for the Deseret News. Zach Van Eck, the guy that broke this story, was familiar with my work. And he said, hey, could you call this guy and at least talk to him and maybe maybe go up there and just, give him a shoulder or something. He needs somebody to talk to. So I dropped everything, and the following day I went all the way up there. It was almost a 1,000-mile round trip. But, I stood there in 105 degree heat listening to him. And he showed me the tops of the cottonwood trees that had been sheared off by an object that came through one of the portals too fast and couldn't break in time and sheared off, 60, 70-foot cottonwood trees. The tops were all lopped off. And this had just occurred because I saw all the branches laying there. Big 14-inch, circles punched into hardpan that would have taken 9 tons of weight to do. There's a number of things that he showed me that really, and I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, and I've got a pretty good sense of when people are, being truthful, when they're really scared, when they're really in a place of fear, when they're, when they're amazed versus feigning amazement.
Right.
I'm pretty good at reading people, and this guy came across as sincere as any witness that I've ever interviewed, and it is the most bizarre case, I think, on record. And I'm really glad that Robert Bigelow, spent a lot of money, $250,000 to buy the ranch, and then probably spent millions of dollars monitoring it. Even if he's not going to release the information to the public, I'm glad at least somebody is attempting to throw money at this and really come to some firm conclusions about what we're dealing with. I think he's more confused now than when he was before he bought the ranch. That's a whole other story.
Now they did legitimate scientific research on some of these mutilations and stuff. Why did they stop releasing the information? Any idea?
Well, they never started. They never did release the information.
Oh, I thought they released some.
They did release information about a case they had in Utah where they found whatever that material that we used to kill people with lethal injection. They found that material in the eye. The potassium chloride, or
I forget
know what it is, potassium cyanide. They found it in the oculus, the eye fluid of the animal. The animal was almost devoid of copper. That's a very interesting paper that they did release. They also released a paper that equated the proximity of animal mutilations to there's a linkage somewhere in their minds to mad cow disease. Colm Kelleher, who was the managing director for the National Institute of Discovery Sciences, which was the scientific group that Bigelow funded, who monitored the Skinwalker Ranch. Colm is a microbiologist, and he wrote a really good book called Brain Trust, which links the outbreak of mad cow disease and the mutilation phenomenon. It's a really important book, and I'm really sad that so many people chose not to buy it and read it, because it's very sobering and a bit frightening. And I did use several sections from his book, from his summary chapter, looking at this whole potential link between mad cow disease and the cattle mutilation phenomenon. I think it's smoking gun information, and that's one of the areas that we're really going to be looking into as we analyze the first book and go and get the second book completed.
So how is it that with all these cases, no one's ever been caught, and there really haven't been any witnesses to this? How is that even possible at this point?
Well, there have been witnesses. That's not exactly true. And there was a guy convicted, but he was convicted in 1902. That's a $64,000 question. You would think that if it was helicopters, that one would crash, somebody would run out of gas, he'd clip some trees, and, somebody would drop something, or, somebody would make a mistake. I mean, look at the so-called, assassination of Osama bin Laden, if that was really him.
Right.
But they did land a couple of choppers there, and of course one of them, had a problem and lost its tail rotor, which they had to go in and try to retrieve, I think, or blow up so that the stealth technology wasn't released to the public.
Right.
But, mechanical things fail, humans mess up. And the fact that nobody has messed up, that this has been such a slick operation for so many decades, really makes you wonder. Maybe all this is ETs. Maybe Linda Howe's right. Maybe aliens are here gathering parts for lipinized stew, or maybe it's high-tech chefs coming back from the future to harvest organs from illegal, protein sources in the future. I don't think cattle can be maintained as a protein source for much longer. Cattle are the most detrimental thing in the environment besides man. Yeah. They're the largest source of freshwater pollution, the largest creator of deserts, the single biggest reason why we're cutting down the rainforest to make room for more cattle. Some of the most horrific diseases imaginable come from cattle. We just had a release of anthrax at the CDC, and they think 85 people may have been inadvertently exposed to anthrax spores. This was just a few days ago, a week or so ago. Cattle are the second largest, arguably, source of ozone-depleting gases. They belch and fart once every 2 minutes. That's millions of tons of methane that's going up into the air. And don't forget, we have 1.37 billion cattle on the planet. If you added them up on one side of the scale and added humans, they'd probably weigh more.
Right.
So they take up 25% of the land mass. we're not going to be able to continue eating cattle and utilizing it as a protein source. As more countries become affluent and start developing a middle class, one of the real status symbols of becoming affluent is being able to afford to eat beef. And so as more and more people get into a place of being affording the luxury of eating beef, you're going to have more and more beef being consumed by countries that aren't consuming as much now. The level of beef consumption in the United States has actually been dropping since 75. 75 was the height of the cattle mutilation phenomenon. It was also the height of the numbers of cattle in the United States, and was also the height of how many pounds of beef per capita we would eat as Americans. So it's been going downhill ever since, and I hope it continues to slide. But if it doesn't do it quickly, we're really, we're playing around with fire here using cattle as a protein source. It really can't continue for various environmental and health reasons.
All right. And that stuff is, you go into a great bit of detail in the last chapter of the book about the mad cow disease and what we use cattle for, how we take care of them, and why it's not sustainable.
Right.
What would you say?
Let me put the disclaimer out there. I eat beef. I love beef. Okay. I will eat another hamburger in my life. I'm sure of it. I'm not like Oprah. I'm not dumb enough to say on on a radio station that what she said. And I don't have a lawyer that I can spend $1 million getting myself off a frivolous lawsuit. So I'm a beef eater. I love beef. As rare as you dare. What I put in the book. I'm a red, white, and blue American who loves my steaks bloody raw.
Well, what do you think the most overlooked thing about these mutilation cases is?
The most overlooked thing is the actual facts that are involved here, because certain investigators have been touting this ET, scenario and this ET explanation as the end-all, be-all explanation. People just now, I think, assume that it's aliens coming down and gathering genetic material, because that's been what's been force-fed to everybody for 30 years. And I think the most overlooked thing is the actual body of data. Now that we have a book where all these investigators' databases have been coalesced into one place, you get a chance to see, the incredible, enormous number of cases and how varied they are, and how, we have cases where, helicopters are seen around the site. Ranchers fire at them, the helicopters fire back. I mean, those aren't aliens flying helicopters. They don't use sixes. So, I think the most overlooked thing is the actual, incredible amount of documented information about these cases, and that the aberrant cases of the UFO cases or the occult cases, they're very few and far between compared to the huge amount, thousands and thousands and thousands of cases of the classic mutilation.
All right. And I guess my last question for you for tonight is, how do you feel when you've spent so many years on this work and someone just throws out an article dismissing it without any kind of real research or anything like that?
Well, and that's happened a bunch. All I can do is try to privately contact them, maybe spank them a little bit on some website or whatever, and put my comment in about, well, if you did your research, you wouldn't say something, so, ill-conceived as that, or whatever my comment is. But then I do try to contact them publicly, because we need people to be interested enough to get involved and help the ranching community solve these cases. They don't appear to be as prevalent as they were, obviously, in the 70s, but it is still a problem. Cases are still being reported. So I think we don't want to scare people away that are interested enough to at least address the subject, but we need to educate them. We need to get them up to speed on what this actually is, what kind of data we actually have to go on, and to really be as objective about it as possible, I think, is really important. So that would be. I don't want to scare people away by spanking them for making ill-considered comments or whatever, but at the same time, they're just contributing to the ignorance of the American public and the Western public.
All right. Okay. And the book, again, is Stalking the Herd, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery. You also have a trilogy of books out on the San Luis Valley?
Correct.
And another one called Stalking the Tricksters, right?
Which is the trickster archetype is very much involved in this whole mystery of the cows, boy, I'll tell you.
So all these books do involve, to some degree, the cattle mutilation mystery, right?
Well, yeah, they're mentioned in all of them. In the Trickster book, it's part of a chapter, yeah.
Okay. And the new book will be out whenever you get it done, but people can also check you out. What's your website?
Well, I have the Paracast radio show every Sunday night. It's theparacast.com.
Right.
Our archive, all for free. Been around for 8 years. And my website is ourstrangeplanet.com. It's a strange planet. It's ourstrangeplanet.com. And I do have a dedicated site, stalkingtheherd.com.
Okay. All right. And you're also a musician.
I am indeed.
And you've had, how many bands have you been in?
Oh, God, I lost count. I was in 4 or 5 in New York, a big one in Boston, 4 or 5 in Colorado, and I'm in a band now. It's a progressive Native American kind of rock band called Black Raven.
Black Raven. Okay, and we're going to hear something from which band?
Say again now?
We're going to hear something here from one of your bands. Which band is it?
Oh, no, that's from my first solo album. I did an album imagining what indigenous music would sound like in the 22nd century.
Oh.
This is a piece I did that kind of second-guessed what Australian Aborigine music will sound like in 100 years.
Huh. All right. I can actually see that. This is a piece called Dreamtime, and I thank you so much for spending some time with us and talking to us about this.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for having me on, and I'll come back and give you an update.
All right. That sounds great. Maybe we can have you back when you have your analysis book out.
There you go.
All right. So here is Dreamtime, and is this just under Christopher O'Brien then?
Mandala is my solo kind of world music name.
Okay, Mandala.
You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.